Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. This week in the Americas, we look at UN plans to expand its force in Haiti and the latest escalation between the US and Venezuela. In Europe, Middle East, and Africa, we cover the likely collapse of the French government, Russia's preparations for a major ground offensive in Ukraine, rising tensions in Libya, and new sanctions measures against Iran. And in Asia-Pacific, we assess the aftermath of a devastating earthquake in Afghanistan and Pakistan, alongside continuing unrest in Indonesia. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where the United Nations is moving to expand its force in Haiti. On August 29th, the UN Security Council began discussions on a draft resolution aimed at expanding and strengthening the Multinational Security Support Mission, or MSS. The resolution, put forward by the United States and Panama, seeks to transform the MSS into a so-called gang suppression force. The new force would be overseen by a standing group of representatives from contributing nations: Kenya, Guatemala, El Salvador, Jamaica, and the Bahamas, as well as the US and Canada. So far, fewer than 1,000 personnel, mainly from Kenya, have been deployed to Haiti, less than half of the 2,500 troops originally planned. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The draft resolution comes after a warning from UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres on August 28th. He stated that Haiti is on the brink of state collapse, with armed gangs controlling up to 90% of the capital and increasingly consolidating power in other parts of the country. The violence has displaced more than 1.3 million people, and over 6 million Haitians are now estimated to require humanitarian assistance. Essential services, including healthcare, education, and security, have effectively collapsed. UNICEF has also reported a 5-fold increase in violations against children in 2024, including executions and forced recruitment by gangs. Meanwhile, Haiti's humanitarian appeal remains the most underfunded in the world, with only 10% of required resources received. The MSS has so far been largely ineffective at combating Haiti's gangs. It suffers from a lack of manpower, communications equipment, medical infrastructure, and armored mobility. As a result, the mission has been unable to reclaim territory from the gangs or secure critical transport corridors needed to re-establish state authority and restore humanitarian access. Sources indicate that the new anti-gang force would deploy up to 5,500 personnel and carry a 12-month authorization to take all necessary measures to carry out its mandate. The plan also includes establishing a UN office in Port-au-Prince to provide full logistical support, including fuel, medical services, ground transportation, and drone surveillance for deployed forces. The United States and Canada are likely to provide funding, logistical coordination, and strategic direction, but have not yet committed to sending troops. If the resolution passes and the new task force deploys, it is unlikely to arrive in time to restore sufficient order for Haiti to hold general elections scheduled for November 15th. There is also a realistic possibility that the deployment could worsen the security situation in the short term. Intensified military operations, especially in densely populated urban areas, could push gang activity into less affected regions and are likely to trigger retaliatory violence, resulting in high civilian casualties. Many recent deaths have already been attributed to security operations. Furthermore, if rules of engagement are poorly defined or oversight and accountability are limited, the risk of human rights abuses will increase. Such outcomes could undermine the legitimacy of both the task force and the Haitian government, ultimately strengthening the gangs, which have positioned themselves as a parallel authority. Staying in the Americas, where Venezuela has accused the United States of regime change following a major naval deployment. On September 1st, during a rare press conference, President Nicolas Maduro claimed Washington was seeking to topple his government in response to recent U.S. naval activity in the Caribbean. The United States has deployed guided missile destroyers, amphibious assault ships, an attack submarine, and maritime patrol aircraft to the region, describing the move as part of a broader counter-narcotics operation. However, Washington has long accused Maduro of complicity in the drug trade, and it recently increased its bounty to $50 million for credible intelligence, leading to his arrest, citing charges of narcotics trafficking and links to transnational criminal networks. On September 2nd, President Trump released a video on his Truth Social account, showing what is alleged to be a U.S. drone strike on a vessel suspected of smuggling narcotics. The strike reportedly killed 11 people on board. The vessel was said to belong to the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua, which the Trump administration recently designated as a foreign terrorist organization. Now our assessment. Venezuela has responded to the U.S. deployment with a defensive posture. Caracas has activated 4.5 million militia members, deployed 15,000 troops to the Colombian border, and expanded its drone and naval patrols. The Maduro government will also likely exploit Washington's aggressive stance to consolidate power and reinforce its narrative of U.S. hostility, a move that will likely help bolster its domestic legitimacy. Venezuela has long laid claim to the oil-rich Essequibo region in neighboring Guyana and has previously sought ways to destabilize or interfere with the country. Guyana held general elections on September 1st, and there is a realistic possibility that the timing of the U.S. naval deployment was partly intended to deter Venezuelan interference and to reassure regional partners of Washington's commitment to Guyana's security. However, the drone strike on a narcotics smuggling vessel linked to Venezuela could mark a significant shift in U.S. counter-narcotics strategy. The Foreign Terrorist Organization designation of Tren de Aragua provides Washington with the legal authority to conduct unilateral military action against the group. The naval deployment has also enabled U.S. forces to closely monitor and strike such targets in international waters, a more permissible environment that is unlikely to trigger major escalation with Venezuela. It is too early to assess whether the strike was primarily symbolic, intended to send a strategic message to Caracas and other groups designated as foreign terrorist organizations, such as several Mexican cartels, or if it marks the start of a broader offensive campaign against transnational criminal organizations. If it does signal a wider campaign, the use of lethal force against criminal groups is likely to provoke significant backlash, both domestically and internationally. Criminal organizations would likely adapt their tactics and could retaliate against U.S. interests, while regional partners may reduce cooperation with Washington, ultimately undermining broader international efforts against narcotics trafficking and organized crime. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East and Africa, where France is bracing for a confidence vote that may collapse the government. On September 8th, Prime Minister François Bayroul's government is likely to lose a parliamentary confidence vote on its proposed national budget, which would result in its collapse. Bayrou, the third prime minister appointed by President Emmanuel Macron in just over a year, has pushed for unpopular welfare reforms and tax hikes in an effort to reduce France's growing deficit and debt. Following the announcement of the confidence vote, both the left, led by the populist France Unbowed Party, and the right-wing National Rally pledged to vote against the government, leaving it without a parliamentary majority. Bayrou's budget remains deeply unpopular. A citizen-led strike initiative has been announced for the week beginning September 8th, and France's major labor unions have pledged to stage a nationwide strike on September 18th and 19th. Organizers have said the strikes will proceed, regardless of whether Bayrou remains in office. Now for our team's assessment. Bayrou's gamble, which now appears likely to backfire, was almost certainly based on the assumption that the National Rally would continue its informal truce with the government. This arrangement, while falling short of a formal alliance, had allowed Bayrou to survive several previous no-confidence motions. However, National Rally leader Marine Le Pen was sentenced in March to a 5-year ban on running for office in her embezzlement trial. Bayrou likely calculated that the party would avoid provoking a government crisis while its political leadership remains uncertain. Having now lost the right wing, Bayrou is also unlikely to secure a last-minute deal with the socialists. Party leader Olivier Faure has already confirmed that the socialists will vote against the government, almost certainly recognizing that backing an unpopular prime minister would risk losing voters to France unbowed. The government's collapse is likely to trigger large-scale and potentially violent unrest. French labor unions have already signaled their intent to strike, regardless of the confidence vote's outcome, almost certainly aiming to maximize pressure on the Macron administration and constrain its policy options. They likely calculate that a weakened Élysée will struggle to push through an austerity budget and may be forced to compromise with the left. As a result, widespread civil unrest is highly likely in the short term, beginning on September 8th and continuing through the following 2 weeks. Paris is expected to be the epicenter, where disruptions to travel, services, and business operations are almost certain. Still in the region, where Moscow is preparing to intensify its ground offensives in Ukraine as diplomacy stalls. Diplomatic efforts to end the war have faltered, with Russia showing little interest in direct bilateral peace talks between President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. On September 1st, a senior Kremlin official stated there was no agreement on a bilateral meeting. That same day, during a speech at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, Putin reiterated that peace could only be achieved if the root causes of the war are addressed. Speaking again at the summit on September 3rd, Putin said he would be willing to meet Zelensky if the Ukrainian president visited Moscow. He added that if diplomacy fails, Russia will have to achieve its objectives by military means. At the same time, Russia is carrying out a significant redeployment of forces to the front lines in Donetsk Oblast. Units from secondary axes, including Kursk and Sumy, have been shifted toward positions near Dobropilya and Pokrovsk. These include elements of the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, while Russian airborne forces have also been observed arriving in Donetsk. On September 2nd, 2 South Korean lawmakers stated that their National Intelligence Service estimated around 2,000 North Korean troops deployed to Ukraine have already been killed, and that Pyongyang is planning to send a further 6,000 soldiers. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Before the August 15th Alaska summit between U.S. President Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, Washington's main pressure point on Moscow was the demand for an unconditional ceasefire as a prelude to comprehensive peace talks. The original 50-day deadline Trump set on July 14th, under threat of secondary sanctions, has now expired. The burst of diplomacy leading up to the Alaska summit likely eased immediate U.S. pressure. Even so, Washington has imposed a 50% tariff on India for continuing to purchase Russian oil. Bilateral or trilateral direct peace talks between Putin, Zelensky, and potentially Trump are now highly likely Washington's primary diplomatic objective. The Kremlin has almost certainly continued to delay and obstruct the prospect of such a meeting, with officials repeatedly stressing the need for extensive preparations. Putin's invitation for Zelensky to travel to Moscow is almost certainly disingenuous. His personal safety could not realistically be guaranteed, and there would be a high risk of arrest. The Kremlin has continued to use diplomacy primarily to ward off U.S. pressure, divide Ukraine's allies, and seek concessions in pursuit of its broader objectives. Meanwhile, Russian forces are highly likely preparing to intensify offensives in Donetsk. Moscow almost certainly believes it can secure more favorable terms through battlefield gains than through negotiations. Russia has already shifted significant resources and manpower to Donetsk. Reports suggest that the incoming North Korean reinforcements are primarily combat engineers or troops destined for rear area deployments. These forces will likely be tasked with bolstering Russian defenses in Kursk, where Ukraine has carried out several incursions. This move will likely allow Moscow to laterally redeploy more of its own troops to Donetsk for expanded offensives. At the same time, it will likely constrain Ukraine's ability to seize Russian territory, limiting Kyiv's leverage in any future negotiations. We now move to Libya, where tensions are rising as rival forces mobilize on the outskirts of Tripoli. Over the past week, forces aligned with the Tripoli-based Government of National Unity, led by Prime Minister Abdul Hamid Dbeibeh, have mobilized outside the capital. On August 28th, reports emerged of large convoys of vehicles and heavy weaponry moving from the Misrata area toward Tripoli. Libyan media have warned of a potentially imminent confrontation between GNU forces and the RADA Special Deterrence Forces militia. Osama Hamad, Prime Minister of the rival Tobruk-based Government of National Stability, has strongly condemned the recent mobilizations and pledged to protect the security of Tripoli. In addition, 40 members of the Tobruk-based House of Representatives have called for Prime Minister Dbeibeh's immediate resignation. Unconfirmed reports also suggest that Libyan National Army forces have begun moving toward the ceasefire front lines, separating the two rival governments. Amid the rising tensions, on September 2nd, a suicide vehicle-borne improvised explosive device was detonated outside the headquarters of the Dbeibeh-aligned 444th Combat Brigade in Bani Walid. No group has claimed responsibility for the attack, and no casualties have yet been reported. Now, our assessment. The Government of National Unity has long been plagued by factional infighting and a lack of centralized control over its forces. Power in Tripoli is fragmented between powerful militias with shifting allegiances to different factions within the GNU. Nevertheless, Prime Minister Dbeibeh has almost certainly been working to consolidate power and secure a monopoly on force in western Libya. In May, Tripoli saw its heaviest fighting in years, following the killing of Abdelghani al-Kikli, also known as Ganiwa, the commander of the Stability Support Apparatus militia. The SSA was a powerful force that controlled the densely populated Abu Salim neighborhood and key southern access points to the capital. In the aftermath, Dbeibeh-aligned forces, particularly the 444th and 111th Brigades, quickly seized SSA territory before clashing with the Rada militia, which controls the Mitiga complex, including Mitiga International Airport. A ceasefire ended the heavy fighting, but the current mobilization is likely preparation for a potentially imminent attack on Rada positions across eastern and southeastern Tripoli. Rada is likely the most powerful remaining militia in Tripoli not aligned with Dbeibeh. After failing to defeat Rada during the fighting in May, Dbeibeh has likely mobilized a larger contingent of forces from across GNU-controlled Libya to achieve this goal. With the outbreak of major clashes appearing imminent, sources indicate that negotiations are underway between GNU leaders and Rada, facilitated by the UN mission in Libya. There is a realistic possibility that the show of force now being applied by Dbeibeh could compel Rada to make concessions, particularly a withdrawal from the Mitiga complex, and avert a wider conflict. If GNU forces launch an offensive against Rada-controlled areas of Tripoli, it will highly likely trigger fighting across the city, characterized by the use of heavy weaponry. While widespread civil unrest is unlikely during periods of intense combat, it is likely that protests will follow once the fighting subsides. There is a realistic possibility that factional fighting in Tripoli could spark a wider conflict between the GNU and Khalifa Haftar's Libyan National Army. The LNA, which de facto controls territory under the rival Government of National Stability, may be emboldened to intervene against the GNU. The risk of a broader conflict breaking out will partly depend on whether Rada can be swiftly defeated. A limited rapid offensive would still likely be followed by international condemnation and domestic unrest. But if fighting in Tripoli becomes protracted, the likelihood of LNA involvement will increase, as Haftar could move to exploit any perceived weakness of the GNU. Such a development would risk a return to full-scale civil war in Libya. And finally, we look at Iran, where Germany has urged its citizens to leave as sanctions are expected to be reimposed. On August 29th, Berlin warned its citizens to immediately leave Iran and to avoid traveling there, citing the risk of retaliation over Germany's role in triggering new sanctions tied to Iran's nuclear program. The announcement came one day after Germany, France, and the United Kingdom moved to trigger the snapback mechanism of the 2015 nuclear deal, formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. If activated, the mechanism would reimpose United Nations sanctions on Iran within 30 days. Iran has rejected the move, arguing that the three European nations have no legal authority to reactivate sanctions. Tehran also noted that both Russia and China support its position. The Iranian Foreign Ministry warned that the decision would seriously undermine its ongoing process with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Officials described the move as escalatory and vowed that it would be met with appropriate responses. Now, our team's assessment. The decision to begin a process that could reimpose sanctions on Iran will almost certainly trigger a major deterioration in relations between Tehran and the three European nations. So far, only Germany has issued a direct warning to its citizens, but similar statements from the UK and France are likely. The threat environment for all E3 nationals and organizations in Iran has almost certainly increased. Tehran has a long history of arbitrary detentions, exit bans, and the practice of hostage diplomacy, detaining foreign or dual nationals to gain leverage for concessions such as sanctions relief. European consular assistance in Iran has already been scaled back, limiting the ability of diplomatic missions to support their citizens in country. The threat is almost certainly higher for dual nationals of Iran and the three European states, as Tehran does not officially recognize dual nationality. Such individuals are likely to be treated solely as Iranian and denied consular protection. E3-linked NGOs and businesses operating in Iran are also likely at greater risk of retaliatory measures. These could include visa or license revocations, increased physical and electronic surveillance, bank account freezes, SIM card deactivation, fines, and in extreme cases, asset seizures. Outside Iran, UK, French and German companies and public institutions are likely at higher risk of Iranian, state-sponsored cyber attacks. These could lead to data breaches, operational disruption, and reputational damage. Iran has previously responded to renewed sanctions by accelerating its nuclear program. Conflict with Israel has severely weakened its proxy forces, while Tehran has also suffered heavy losses to its conventional military capabilities. It now likely views the resumption of its nuclear program as the most viable path to restoring a degree of strategic deterrence. Such a course of action would almost certainly raise regional tensions, reduce opportunities for diplomatic de-escalation, and increase the risk of future military escalation. Shifting to Asia-Pacific, where Afghanistan and Pakistan were struck by a devastating earthquake and a series of aftershocks. On August 31st, a magnitude 6.0 quake hit near Jalalabad, Afghanistan, devastating the eastern provinces of Kunar and Nangarhar. The earthquake caused heavy casualties and widespread destruction. According to the Taliban-run Interior Ministry, the death toll has already exceeded 1.4 thousand, with at least 3.1 thousand people injured across the affected areas. The worst-hit area is Kunar's Nurgal district, where at least 3 villages have been destroyed. Afghan disaster officials have warned that hundreds of people may still be trapped beneath the rubble. In Nangarhar province, at least 10 deaths and 250 injuries have been reported, with Dara-e-Noor district among the hardest-hit locations. Taliban authorities have dispatched relief teams to the worst-affected regions, with helicopters airlifting the injured from remote villages to hospitals. Relief efforts remain difficult, however, as mountainous terrain and blocked roads continue to hamper access. The earthquake's tremors were also felt across the border in Pakistan, with shaking reported in Islamabad, Peshawar, Hangu, Mansehra, and Malakand. Precautionary measures were implemented in parts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the Federal Capital Region, though no significant casualties have been reported. On September 2nd, a magnitude 5.2 aftershock struck eastern Afghanistan, further complicating relief efforts. Foreign governments, including Pakistan, China, India, the UK, and Switzerland, as well as international aid groups and the United Nations, have delivered relief packages to affected areas. Now, our assessment. Afghanistan is highly prone to large earthquakes, particularly in the Hindu Kush mountain range, where the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates meet. Aftershocks have already occurred, and more are highly likely in the coming days and weeks. Most will likely be small to moderate in the magnitude 3.0 to 4.0 range, but further quakes of magnitude 5.0 or above remain a realistic possibility. Afghanistan is among the least disaster-resilient countries in the world. With many unreinforced and non-earthquake resistant buildings, even moderate aftershocks could trigger secondary collapses, complicating rescue efforts and causing further casualties. The topography of the affected regions and adjoining Pakistani districts makes landslides and rockfalls a significant risk, particularly along river valleys and cut slopes. Such slope failures could block roads, cut off communities, and even cause flooding if river channels are obstructed. Damage to water and sanitation networks will also highly likely increase the risk of waterborne diseases, adding further strain on hospitals and clinics. Access challenges, including debris, landslides, damaged bridges, and the presence of non-state armed groups in parts of eastern Afghanistan, will almost certainly complicate the delivery of humanitarian aid and disaster relief. In Pakistan, no significant damage has been recorded so far. However, localized infrastructure disruption in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, along with lingering road closures and communications outages, is highly likely. An elevated landslide risk in hill districts, particularly following aftershocks or heavy rainfall, could further worsen the humanitarian situation in areas already affected by monsoon flooding. Additionally, congestion at the Torkham border crossing is likely if humanitarian flows and medical referrals increase. And finally, in Asia-Pacific, Indonesia continues to face unrest after violent clashes between protesters and security forces. The protests, which began on August 25th, have continued into this week. Tensions escalated after a mobile Brigade Corps vehicle ran over motorcycle taxi driver Afan Kurniawan on August 28th. A video of the incident circulated widely online, sparking public outrage. On August 29th, protests spread to Jakarta, where demonstrators gathered near Brimob and Metropolitan Police headquarters and staged blockades across the city centre, particularly in the Kuitang area. Violent clashes reportedly broke out after protesters tried to block a passing police convoy and threw rocks at the vehicles. Brimob units responded with tear gas to disperse the crowds, further escalating tensions. Protesters then attempted to storm the Metropolitan Police headquarters in Jakarta. Demonstrations were also recorded in several other major cities, including Yogyakarta, Surabaya, Makassar, Medan, and Bandung. On August 30th, clashes erupted again in Jakarta after protesters threw bottles, rocks, and firecrackers. Security forces responded with tear gas and rubber bullets, and electricity in the area was temporarily cut off. Protesters set fire to 7 bus stations across Jakarta, forcing services to be suspended. A police station and provincial government building in Surabaya, as well as areas near the parliament buildings in Jakarta, were also torched. On September 1st, 5 people were arrested during a protest at the Makassar police headquarters in South Sulawesi. So far, at least 10 people have been killed, and hundreds more injured or arrested nationwide. The unrest has prompted the Jakarta government to urge companies to adopt work-from-home policies and allow schools in affected areas to shift to distance learning. In response to public anger, the government has also agreed to cut some lawmakers' perks, including the controversial $3,000 housing allowance. On September 1st, Indonesian students and civil society groups announced they were calling off protests, citing fears of a crackdown by authorities. However, sporadic demonstrations have continued, with protests reported in central Jakarta on September 2nd. Looking ahead, the All-Indonesian Student Executive Board Alliance is set to hold a Save Indonesia rally on September 4th, with around 205 police officers expected to be deployed. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Following the government's reversal on the housing allowance and the decision by unions and student groups to call off protests, there is a realistic possibility that unrest will subside over the coming week. However, momentum could be sustained if clashes break out during the planned September 4th protest, or if videos of perceived crackdowns by security forces circulate widely on social media. The recent unrest likely forms part of a broader wave of anti-government sentiment in 2025, which has already triggered several rounds of protests. Student-led demonstrations over austerity measures erupted on February 17th under the slogan Indonesia Gelap, or Dark Indonesia. The protests that began on August 25th followed the release of reports about a new monthly housing allowance for politicians, worth roughly 20 times the national minimum wage. While this was the immediate trigger, it almost certainly acted only as a catalyst for deeper frustrations over low wages, cuts to government funding, job losses in the textile industry, corruption, and the growing role of the military in civilian life. Tensions have almost certainly risen following widespread accusations of police brutality, and given Indonesia's economic pressures, periodic protests are likely to recur across the country in the medium term. Real wages have failed to keep pace with inflation and rising living costs. Unemployment has increased, while manufacturing's share of GDP has dropped from 32% in 2002 to just 19% in 2024. Economic growth slowed to 4.8% in the second quarter of 2025, Indonesia's weakest in 4 years, and well below President Prabowo's 8% target. With Indonesia's youth disproportionately affected by the poor-performing economy, student-led protests are likely to remain a persistent feature of the country's political landscape. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.